Until we have a complete understanding of the threat, it's important to stay home.
This is analog horror, and for the past couple of years we've seen a massive rise in this genre of scares, and it's easy to see why.
The following species are considered extremely dangerous and are to be avoided at all costs.
Today, lady and man, we are taking a deep dive into analog horror and even going over some real-world events that influenced this genre. And honestly, some of these events are terrifying. Before we get into why analog horror is so terrifying, let's first define what it is. Analog horror is a subgenre of horror that uses the aesthetics of old technology to deliver its scares. Imagine flickering TV screens, distorted VHS tapes, corrupted audio recordings, emergency broadcast interruptions, and other technological artifacts of the 80s and 90s. There's no glossy, high-definition production here. Instead, we're left with visuals, warped sound, and a sense that what we're watching isn't meant to be seen.
The government would like to inform the public of a new fungus disease spreading like fire that is known as uranium fungus.
Unlike traditional horror, analog horror doesn't rely on elaborate effects, monsters, or even explicit explanations of what's happening. It's subtle and uses the imperfections of old technologies as a way to make you feel deeply spooked. The horror here doesn't come from seeing something up on the screen. It comes from not knowing what you're looking at, from the feeling that something is wrong, but no matter how much you try, you can't quite figure out what it is. I think one of the best parts about analog horror is that it often presents itself as found footage or discovered material. And in traditional horror, we always understand the threat. There's usually a clear enemy, a ghost, a monster, or P. Diddy. But in analog horror, the threat isn't always so clear. In fact, the scariest part is that you often don't know what's happening at all. Take the popular YouTube series Local 58, for example. Created by Chris Straub, Local 58 appears to be a collection of eerie emergency broadcasts from a local TV station. Each episode starts out innocently enough, a weather report, a government PSA, or a patriotic message. But as the broadcast goes on, you start to notice that something isn't right. The message grows darker, the visuals become unsettling, and soon you realize that you're watching something you're not supposed to see. The episode titled Contingency presents an emergency message instructing viewers to protect themselves from an unknown threat. As the broadcast continues, the message changes in chilling ways, eventually urging viewers to take control of their fate in the most disturbing way possible. In Local 58, you never see a monster. You never get a full explanation, and you're left with a deep, unsettling feeling that whatever you just saw wasn't meant for you. This is the heart of analog horror, and it taps into a fundamental human fear, the fear of the unknown. The horror here doesn't need to show you a clear threat, it leaves you to imagine it, which can often be more terrifying than anything you'd see on a screen. Another reason analog horror is so effective is because it uses familiar formats. News broadcasts, PSAs, weather reports, children's shows. These are things that we see every day, things that we trust to keep us informed or entertained. But in analog horror, that trust is broken. The messages are twisted, distorted, and warped, as if something dark is hiding just beneath the surface. Imagine turning on your television to see a children's show from the 80s with its bright colors and cheerful characters, but as you watch, the screen flickers. The colors become muted and the characters start saying things that don't make sense. This is the horror of corrupted innocence, a theme that analog horror uses to great effect. It's the feeling that something safe has been twisted into something terrifying, and it leaves you feeling vulnerable and unsettled. The Mandela Catalogue is another great example of that technique. Created by Alex Kister, the Mandela Catalogue is a YouTube series that presents itself as a series of public service announcements warning us of alternates, entities that impersonate humans.
Until we have a complete understanding of the threat, it's important to stay home, lock all doors and windows, and have access to a loaded firearm or any ranged weapon at all times.
The series uses low-quality footage, distorted faces, and strange audio to create a sense of unease. The alternates are human-like, but not quite human, and the more you watch, the more you feel something sinister is hiding in this footage. The familiarity of these formats makes the horror feel more personal. You're not watching a supernatural horror movie set in a haunted mansion. You're watching a broadcast that could have been on your television in your home. If we look at this footage of a modern day horror movie, and then we compare this to analog horror, you can tell which of the two is more terrifying. The corrupted media makes you question reality, blurring the lines between the safe and the terrifying, whereas the modern horror movie gives us a cheap jump scare. There's something so unsettling about old technology. Unlike the sleek, polished gadgets that we have today, analog technology has imperfections. It's static, grainy visuals, distorted audio, and glitches. These flaws make analog horror feel so raw. The low quality footage makes you feel like you're looking into a world that's slightly off from our own, a place where strange things lurk in the background. And this fear is amplified by the concept of lost media. In analog horror, the tapes and broadcasts are often presented as something that's been lost to time, an artifact from a forgotten era. Imagine finding an old VHS tape in your basement, labeled only with a vague title. You play it, and at first it seems like a regular recording, maybe a news report or a home video, but as you watch, you notice strange things. Faces in the background that don't belong, strange sounds and messages that feel directed at you. The concept of lost media plays on our curiosity and our fear of the unknown, making analog horror feel like a forbidden experience. One technique that analog horror often uses is subliminal messaging. You might see this as a quick flash of text on screen, just long enough to read but not long enough to fully process. The messages are cryptic, unsettling, and seem to be directed at you. For example, in Local 58, some of the messages include phrases like "look away" or "you are on the fastest available route." These messages feel personal, as if the broadcast is aware of your presence, and they make you feel like you're being pulled into a story that you can't escape. Another element of psychological horror in analog horror is the use of distorted faces. Faces are something we're naturally drawn to, something that we instinctively trust. But in analog horror, faces are warped, elongated, or blurred in ways that make them feel wrong. They're close to human, but not quite. And this uncanny valley effect makes us deeply uncomfortable. And if you want to watch a video about the uncanny valley, click up there. Maybe subscribe while you're at it, I don't know. The aesthetics of analog horror are often inspired by real events, especially the fear of government surveillance, emergency broadcasts, and Cold War paranoia from the 80s and 90s. Many analog horror creators used emergency broadcast aesthetics, mimicking the sound and look of old TV warnings and government PSAs. These broadcasts were designed to keep us safe, to alert us in the case of real emergencies. But in analog horror, these broadcasts are twisted, becoming something ominous and untrustworthy. One famous analog horror story, the Wyoming Incident, claims to be based on a real event where a television broadcast in Wyoming was interrupted by a strange signal. Viewers reported seeing distorted faces, hearing strange tones, and receiving cryptic messages like "you are ill and there is no truth in suffering."
Network that can change your pattern.
Though it remains an urban legend, the Wyoming Incident became one of the inspirations for analog horror, showing how real-life events can be transformed into horror stories that play on our collective fears. And the Wyoming Incident was partly true. It was actually based on the Max Headroom Incident, a real event in 1987, when a hacker managed to interrupt 2 television broadcasts in Chicago, replacing the normal programming with a bizarre, distorted figure wearing a Max Headroom mask. The hijacker spoke in a distorted voice, made strange references, and terrified viewers who had no idea what they were watching. The Max Headroom incident showed just how vulnerable our broadcast systems were, and it created a sense of unease around the idea that someone could infiltrate our homes through our TVs. I think one of the most disturbing aspects of analog horror is that it feels real. Unlike traditional horror films, analog horror isn't polished or cinematic, which makes it feel like something you're actually witnessing. It feels like an intrusion, as if something dark had broken through the screen and into our world. Analog horror preys on our nostalgia. For those who grew up in the 80s, 90s, and even the early 2000s, analog horror brings back memories of a time when television and radio were our primary sources of information. There's a sense of comfort in these old broadcasts, but when they're corrupted, the comfort turns into terror. It's as if something from our past has come back, but it's been twisted, changed into something dark and unsettling.